federal government owns around 640 million acres of land in the United States, managed by four main agencies: the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Forest Service. This land, with few exceptions, is open to the public. Beyond federal lands, individual states also hold land in the form of conservation areas, state parks, state recreation areas, and more. Between the federal and state governments, there is an abundance of public land for the average citizen to enjoy. This land is used for all kinds of recreation, for sightseeing, camping, fishing, hunting, and other outdoor sports and activities, and theoretically, nearly all of this land is open for this. However, the reality is much more complicated than that. The United States is a patchwork of parcels of land, some big and many very small. The public lands owned by the government are scattered across the country, and filling in the spaces between are large swaths of public land owned by individuals, organizations, and businesses. The percentage of public versus private land varies by state. Alaska leads the pack, with 89.2% of its land being public, according to data from the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Iowa bookends the other side of the list, with only 1.04% of its land being public. South Dakota falls on the low end of the list as well, with only 7.53% of its total area constituting public land. The scattered nature of public lands in the U.S., along with the abundance of private land, has led in some places to the phenomenon of what is called landlocked public land. This is land owned by the government and open to the public, which the public is unable to access due to it being entirely enclosed within private lands. The Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Project, an organization whose mission it is to guarantee all Americans quality places to hunt and fish, states that there are 16.43 million acres of inaccessible public land located in 22 states, most of which lie in the western half of the country. According to the TRCP, the largest amount of landlocked public land is in Wyoming, where there are 4.1 million acres of inaccessible public land. Here in South Dakota, the numbers are smaller, but the issue is still present. The TRCP identifies 196,000 acres of landlocked federal land in the state, but does not have a number on the amount of state-owned land which is inaccessible. In an effort to find more details, KELOLAND News reached out to Kevin Roebling, the interim department secretary for the South Dakota Game, Fish, and Parks. The SDGFP owns 285,000 acres of public land across the state in 57 different counties, all of which Roebling says is open to the public.
Very few of those acres are landlocked. We have, I would say there's less than a couple thousand acres of GPAs, game production areas that we call them GPAs, that are landlocked throughout the state. The vast majority of our landlocked acres throughout South Dakota are Bureau of Reclamation, BLM. We have national grasslands. There's some, national forests in the Black Hills. There's also school and public lands. Now there's another 700,000 acres of school and public lands out on the landscape. A lot of it's in western South Dakota. Some of those acres are landlocked.
In explaining why the SDGFP has so few landlocked areas, Roebling said that the state does not buy land if it does not have direct access to it.
The entire number of acres that we do feel are landlocked in South Dakota are about 280,000. So you have on top of your 194 of federal, another, almost close to another 86,000 acres of actual public state land that is also landlocked.
Chip Kimball, field manager for the South Dakota Bureau of Land Management, was enthusiastic when discussing the topic and said the Bureau is currently looking into the matter of public access.
We've recognized for a while that we have, along with many public land areas, we have an issue with direct public access to public lands.
The South Dakota BLM manages approximately 274,000 acres of land, and Kimball says about 50,000 acres of that land does not have direct public access.
Some of that land is accessible through other agencies' lands, like the state or other federal agencies, or with the state walk-in area program, but they don't have direct public access.
Kimball says while some land is available to the public via section line access, that often requires people to have a GPS with specific geographical information in order to walk the path between sections.
It's difficult, especially in some of the more rural areas.
In South Dakota, she says, you have a 66-foot corridor that you can walk down on the section line, which can cause conflict between recreationists and landowners if someone strays off the section line. Kimball says that the BLM is currently in the process of defining public access roads in the state, which may cut down on the number of acres previously thought to be landlocked. Currently, they have identified 62 parcels, most of which are in less than 40 acres, that are not accessible to the public via section line access, walk-in areas, direct road access, or through other public lands which do have access. This is about 2,500 acres in total. KELOLAND News also spoke briefly with Jessica Sutt, Public Affairs Specialist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who told us via email that they manage 5 national wildlife refuges and 4 wetland management districts in South Dakota. Each of these public lands offers varying degrees of seasonal wildlife-dependent recreation in accordance with their respective establishing purpose for the wildlife conservation. None of these are known to be landlocked by private land, said Sutt. We also reached out to the U.S. Forest Service to ask about landlocked lands under their jurisdiction, but they were unable to provide specific numbers. A representative for the Forest Service told us that due to current employee vacancies, there was not a lands program specialist on board to discuss the matter, but they are aware of some landlocked parcels south of Custer, South Dakota. Using the South Dakota Game Fish and Park estimate of 280,000 total landlocked acres and subtracting the amount of landlocked area managed by the state and the Bureau of Land Management, we estimate that the U.S. Forest Service maintains between 146,000 and 193,000 acres of landlocked public land in the state. The main issue with landlocked land is that it blocks the public's access to recreational activities on land that they pay for through taxes. Another issue, however, is the ability for agencies to effectively manage these areas. With no legal public access to a parcel of government-owned land, legal issues can get murky. South Dakota House Bill 1140, which was introduced at the request of the Office of the Governor, would restrict the entry of conservation officers onto certain private lands without permission, and is currently working its way through the state legislature. The bill states in part that, quote, no conservation officer may, in the course of performing the duties of a conservation officer, enter any private land unless the conservation officer has the explicit or implied permission of the landowner or lessee. The bill carves out 3 exemptions, saying that a conservation officer can enter onto private land without permission if reasonable suspicion or probable cause exists that a violation of a law that the conservation officer is authorized to enforce has been, is being, or is about to be committed on the private land. To dispatch crippled or distressed wildlife the conservation officer has personally and lawfully observed on the private land, or to respond to emergency situations, accidents, or other threats to public safety occurring on the private land. KELOLAND News spoke with South Dakota Representative Marty Overweg, the chair of the House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee, who told us that the bill's purpose is to bring conservation officer standards up to the same level as other law enforcement officers. He says this bill is not a poacher's bill, as some have called it, saying instead that the bill works to presume landowners' innocence by requiring conservation officers to have probable cause to enter private land. Secretary Roebling is a proponent of the bill.
South Dakota is a private land state. 80% of South Dakota is privately owned. So therefore, we rely very, very heavily on our landowners, on our producers. 1140 just requires us, the department, to obtain landowner permission before entering private property.
Roebling says this is important when building relationships with landowners. Roebling also clarified that this bill would apply not just to state conservation officers, but also to federal officers. He said there has not been any specific incident that he is aware of that has sparked the need for this bill, but that he considers it good policy. While legal questions regarding land rights are always being debated, both the state and federal government are working to open up more of these landlocked areas.
And I'm happy to report that actually in the last 4 years, we've opened up over 34,000 acres that were landlocked to the public.
Roebling says that the department prioritizes opening up this land and that the number one tool is leasing land from private landowners. Meanwhile, the BLM takes a different approach to freeing more of this land.
The BLM has been working for quite some time to identify lands and prioritize lands that we would like to gain public access to. We have a number of methods of doing that through our organization directly. And some of those options include voluntary easements that private landowners would give the public through their private lands. We can exchange property so that we gain the land that is preventing the public access. And then there's outright land acquisition, where it's not an exchange situation, but we're purchasing property that would provide access to valuable portions of public lands.
Kimball says the BLM is also working with the Game Fish and Parks and other non-governmental agencies to open up these lands. For KELOLAND.com, I'm Jacob Newton.